I spent 40 years building an empire with my bare hands, only to hand the keys to the very people who would try to lock me out of it. It turns out the deepest wounds do not come from ruthless competitors. They come from the children sitting at your own dinner table. My name is Arthur. I am 68 years old, and for most of my adult life, the rhythmic pounding of steel presses and the heavy, metallic scent of machine oil were the only things that made sense to me. I built Atlas Manufacturing from a single rented garage with a leaky roof into a regional powerhouse. It was not just a business to me. It was my salvation, my sanctuary when my world fell apart. When my wife, Martha, passed away from an aggressive illness 35 years ago, I was left with a shattered heart, a 5-year-old son named Robert, and a 3-year-old daughter named Elena. The grief was a physical weight, threatening to crush me entirely. To keep from drowning in that sorrow, I poured every single ounce of my soul into the work. I worked 18-hour days. I missed bedtimes. I missed school plays and weekend picnics. I justified my relentless absence by telling myself I was building a fortress of security for my children. I wanted to forge a legacy so indestructible that neither Robert nor Elena would ever know the bitter, humiliating taste of financial struggle. I succeeded. Atlas Manufacturing grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. We supplied precision parts to the aerospace and automotive industries. I paid for their elite private schools, their Ivy League tuitions, and their lavish weddings. I gave them everything I never had. When I turned 67, my bones began to ache in ways they never had before. The late nights poring over blueprints and the early mornings walking the freezing factory floor felt heavier. I realized I had spent my entire life accumulating wealth, but had never taken a single, quiet moment to actually live. I wanted to see the sunrise from a wooden fishing boat instead of a glass boardroom window. I wanted to enjoy the twilight of my life before my time ran out. So, I made the decision to pass the torch. I retained my title as majority shareholder and chairman of the board, but I officially stepped back. I handed the daily operations, the prestigious title of Chief Executive Officer, and the keys to the kingdom over to Robert. Elena, who had recently finished her master's degree in corporate finance, was appointed Chief Financial Officer. I truly thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was empowering the next generation, giving them a massive head start to take Atlas to new, unprecedented heights. I gave them my complete, blind trust. That was my first and nearly fatal mistake. It did not take long for the cracks to show. Barely 6 months into my supposed retirement, I grew restless. I missed the noise. I decided to drop by the factory floor unannounced. I wanted to see the old faces, shake the calloused hands of the men and women who helped me build the place, and smell that familiar metallic tang in the air. Instead of a warm homecoming, I walked into an entirely alien environment. The atmosphere was tense, the workers keeping their heads down. I went looking for Thomas, a man who had been my lead floor manager for 20 years. Thomas was the man who stayed late with me during the lean years, a man whose children I had personally helped put through college. When I asked a nervous young supervisor where he was, the boy swallowed hard and told me Thomas had been let go 2 weeks prior. They called it trimming the fat. My chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. Thomas was not fat. He was the beating heart of the production line. His institutional knowledge was irreplaceable. I took the elevator up to the executive suites. The modest, hard-working environment I had cultivated for decades was entirely gone. It had been replaced by sleek, ridiculously expensive designer furniture, frosted glass walls, and an army of young, arrogant consultants marching around with clipboards. I walked straight into the accounting department and demanded to see the recent company logs. What I saw on those pages made my blood run completely cold. Quality control budgets were being slashed across the board. They were sourcing cheaper, inferior alloys from unverified overseas vendors to artificially boost short-term profit margins. We built parts for airplanes and heavy machinery. Cutting corners on materials was not just bad business. It was incredibly dangerous. And the money they were supposedly saving by firing fiercely loyal staff and compromising our product. It was bleeding out of the company in a raging river of extravagant executive bonuses and questionable expenses. Robert had just used company funds to lease a $500,000 exotic sports car, claiming it was a necessary vehicle for entertaining high-level clients. Elena was constantly expensing month-long networking retreats to luxury ski resorts in Europe. They were treating the company ledger, my life's work, like their own personal, endless piggy bank. I should have looked much closer at the complex financial restructuring Elena had aggressively pushed for during my transition. A subtle, highly technical change I would only understand the true danger of much later. But at that moment, I was just a bitterly disappointed father trying to understand why his children were acting like spoiled, reckless aristocrats. I immediately called a closed-door meeting with the two of them. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany boardroom table. This was the very table where I had negotiated the crucial deals that kept a roof over their heads when they were toddlers. I slammed the ledgers down onto the polished wood. I demanded an explanation for Thomas. I demanded to know why our scrap and defect rate had tripled because of the cheap, garbage metal they were buying. I fully expected them to be embarrassed. I expected an apology, or at least a desperate attempt to defend their business strategy. Instead, Robert simply leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossed his arms over his custom-tailored suit, and sighed heavily. He looked at me. It was not a look of respect from a son, nor was it the deference of an employee speaking to the chairman. It was the weary, utterly arrogant annoyance of a man swatting away a bothersome insect. "Dad," Robert said, his voice dripping with such thick condescension it made my stomach turn. "You are looking at this like a blue-collar mechanic. The game has entirely changed since you started this place. You cannot run a modern, aggressive enterprise with your archaic, handshake and a smile philosophy. We are maximizing shareholder value. We are pivoting to a lean operational model," Elena chimed in, not even bothering to look up from the screen of her smartphone. She examined her perfectly manicured nails as she spoke. "He is right, Dad. You are completely out of touch with reality. The modern market does not care about loyalty to an old floor manager. It cares about quarterly margins. You did a quaint little job building this workshop, but it takes real, educated vision to scale it globally. You are simply too old to grasp the modern economic landscape. Go play golf, Dad. Let the adults handle the business." Quaint little job, archaic, too old, the workshop. The word struck me like actual, physical blows to the jaw. I sat there in stunned silence, looking at the two total strangers sitting across from me. They wore bespoke clothing and heavy gold watches bought entirely with the sweat of my brow and the sacrifice of my youth. Yet, they looked at me with absolute, undisguised disgust. I had spent 35 years ignoring my own happiness, sacrificing my own peace to give them the entire world. And their profound gratitude was to dismiss me as a useless, uneducated relic who was holding back their genius. I left the office that afternoon with a heavy heart, feeling like an absolute failure as a father. I walked to my car in a daze, wondering where I had gone so completely wrong in raising them. I thought their profound arrogance was just the foolish, blind pride of youth. I thought it was an ugly, selfish phase we would eventually have to work through together. But there was a much darker, colder calculation forming behind their eyes. A vile, devastating betrayal was already taking shape in the shadows. An ambush that would soon force me to become a man I never wanted to be again. I told myself that blood was thicker than water, desperately hoping my children's sudden cruelty was just a temporary lapse in judgment fueled by their new corporate power. But the quiet shadows of my own factory were about to reveal a betrayal so profoundly wicked, it would fracture my soul into 1,000 jagged pieces. It was a rainy Tuesday night, about a week after our disastrous boardroom confrontation. The house felt entirely too large and far too quiet. I could not sleep. My mind kept looping back to the disgust in my daughter's eyes and the sneer on my son's face. I needed something to ground me. I realized I had left a small, framed photograph of my late wife, Martha, in my old desk drawer at the office. It was a picture taken on our 5th anniversary, back when we had nothing but a leaky roof and each other. I needed to see her smile. I needed to remember why I started this entire agonizing journey. I drove to Atlas Manufacturing around 10 o'clock at night. The sprawling parking lot was completely empty, save for 2 high-end luxury sedans parked right next to the executive entrance. One belonged to Robert. The other belonged to Richard, Elena's husband. Richard was a slick, high-priced corporate lawyer with a smile that never quite reached his eyes and a habit of speaking to blue-collar workers like they were slow children. I never liked him, but I tolerated him because Elena loved him. I unlocked the side door with my master key and stepped into the cavernous, silent production floor. The machines were powered down, standing like massive iron giants in the dim emergency lighting. I walked quietly up the rear stairwell toward the executive suites, not wanting to disturb whatever late-night strategy session they were having. As I approached the frosted glass doors of the main conference room, I saw a sliver of light spilling out onto the carpet. The door was cracked open just an inch. I reached out to push it open and announce myself, perhaps even offer to buy them a late dinner as a peace offering. But the sound of my own name froze my hand in midair. "Arthur is becoming a massive liability," Richard was saying, his voice smooth and dripping with casual cruelty. "He is snooping around the accounting department, asking questions about the raw material suppliers. If he keeps digging, he is going to find out about the kickbacks from the overseas vendors." I stopped breathing. Kickbacks. My children were taking illegal kickbacks to supply my company with dangerous, substandard metal. "He is just an old man yelling at clouds," Robert replied, his tone dismissive. "He has no actual power anymore. We control the board. He is the majority shareholder." "Robert," Richard snapped back. "He can still call a vote of no confidence. He can audit the books. We need him completely removed from the equation before we execute the buyout with Vance Capital. If Vance gets a whiff of internal family turmoil or those vendor discrepancies, he will pull his $50 million cash offer off the table instantly." Vance Capital. Marcus Vance was a notorious corporate raider, a vulture who bought up struggling manufacturing plants, fired every single employee, sold the heavy machinery for scrap, and liquidated the real estate. Selling Atlas to Vance meant the absolute destruction of everything I had built. It meant hundreds of local families would lose their livelihoods overnight. "So, what is the play, Richard?" Elena asked. Her voice was ice cold, devoid of any hesitation. "How do we amputate him?" "We move forward with the medical proxy," Richard said smoothly. "I have already drafted the initial petition for an involuntary conservatorship. We are going to court to have your father declared mentally unfit to manage his own affairs. We will cite early onset dementia and severe cognitive decline. We will use his recent outburst in the boardroom, his obsession with fired employees, and his paranoia about our modern business practices as evidence that he is losing his grip on reality." My legs suddenly felt like they were made of lead. I leaned heavily against the cold wall of the hallway, pressing my hand over my mouth to stifle the gasp clawing at my throat, my own flesh and blood. They were going to legally erase my mind. "Will a judge actually buy that?" Robert asked, sounding a little nervous. "I have a private psychiatrist on retainer who owes me a very large favor." Richard chuckled darkly. "He will sign the evaluation affidavit without even being in the same room as Arthur. Once the judge grants the emergency injunction, Arthur's shares are automatically transferred to your control as his legal guardians. We vote to sell to Vance the very next morning. By the time your father figures out what day of the week it is, Atlas will belong to Vance Capital, and the 3 of us will be splitting $50 million in pure, untraceable cash." "And what about Dad?" Elena asked. For a fraction of a second, a pathetic, desperate part of my broken heart hoped she would show a sliver of mercy. I hoped she would object to destroying her father's life. "With his shares liquidated, his personal accounts will fall under the conservatorship," Elena continued, crushing that final hope into dust. "We cannot have him living in the main house anymore. He might wander off or cause a scene. We will find him a nice, quiet place, Robert said casually, as if they were discussing what to do with an old, unwanted dog. There is a state-run assisted living facility a few counties over. It is cheap, secure, and far away from the press. We lock him in there, pay the minimal monthly fee out of his seized pension, and we never have to deal with his archaic lectures again. He will not even know the difference in a year. I stood in the darkness, the silence of the hallway roaring in my ears. I did not barge in. I did not scream. I did not smash the frosted glass and wrap my hands around their throats. I simply backed away, step by agonizing step, until I was safely inside my dark, empty office. I sank into my leather chair, and the dam finally broke. I wept. I wept with a profound, soul-crushing agony that I had not felt since the day I buried my wife. I cried for the sweet little boy who used to sit on my shoulders and watch the delivery trucks. I cried for the bright-eyed little girl who used to fall asleep against my chest. Those children were dead. They had been dead for a long time, replaced by these soulless, greedy parasites sitting just down the hall. They were willing to lock me away in a state-run warehouse to rot, just to get their hands on a mountain of cash they did absolutely nothing to earn. I sat in the dark for 2 hours, letting the grief wash over me, letting it scour every ounce of fatherly love and forgiveness from my bones. I realized then that I had entirely misread a specific clause in the liability waiver Elena had urged me to sign last month. A tiny legal trapdoor I now understood was designed to completely shield them from corporate debt. I wiped my face with a handkerchief. The tears stopped. The sorrow evaporated. What replaced it was a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. They thought I was a senile, toothless old dog. They thought my love for them made me blind, weak, and easily disposable. They forgot that before I was an indulgent father, I was a ruthless, hungry street fighter who built a steel empire from nothing. I knew every single hidden fault line in the foundation of Atlas manufacturing, and I knew exactly how to make the entire structure collapse. I stood up, walked over to my desk, and picked up the photograph of Martha. I slipped it quietly into my coat pocket. I looked out the window at the sprawling factory below. If they wanted a war for this company, I was going to give them one. But I was not going to fight them in a courtroom over a fake dementia diagnosis. I was going to let their own boundless greed dig their graves. And then, I was going to gladly kick the dirt over their heads. I left the building as silently as a ghost. As I drove home through the rain, my mind was no longer clouded by hurt or confusion. The father they knew was gone. The founder had returned. I began to mentally draft a blueprint for their absolute destruction, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. They wanted to strip me of everything I owned. I decided I would show them exactly what it felt like to be left with absolutely nothing at all. I spent the entire drive home practicing my best impression of a broken, defeated man, knowing that a single flash of the raging inferno behind my eyes would give my executioners the only warning they needed. To catch a predator, you must first convince them that you are nothing more than helpless, wounded prey. The very next morning, I arrived at the executive suites wearing a heavy wool sweater completely mismatched with my trousers. I intentionally spilled half my coffee on my desk right before the morning briefing. When Robert and Elena confidently strode into my office, I was staring blankly out the window, softly muttering about a shipment from a steel supplier we had not contracted in over 15 years. The look they exchanged was a sickening, silent cocktail of pity and predatory triumph. They thought the immense stress of our recent arguments had finally pushed my aging brain over the cliff. They thought my mind was crumbling exactly on their convenient, accelerated schedule. I called them back into my office later that afternoon. I slumped heavily in my leather chair, dramatically massaging my temples, and allowed a noticeable tremor to shake my hands as I picked up a pen. I told them I was exhausted to my very core. I confessed, with a perfectly manufactured crack in my voice, that my memory was slipping badly, that the relentless noise of the factory floor gave me splitting, blinding headaches, and that I simply could not keep up with their modern, aggressive corporate pace anymore. I told them I was going away. I owned a remote, rustic fishing cabin 300 miles north, nestled deep in the rugged mountains where cell phone towers simply did not reach. I said I needed 3 solid months of complete, undisturbed isolation to rest my weary mind and try to find some peace. Robert could barely conceal the greedy, radiant grin rapidly spreading across his face. He looked like a wolf staring at an unlocked henhouse. Elena, always the meticulous calculator, immediately asked about the daily operational approvals. I told her I did not want to be bothered with a single email, a single phone call, or a single signature while I was gone. I told them I was authorizing a sweeping, temporary transfer of absolute executive power. I brought in our chief legal counsel, a stoic man who had answered solely to me for 2 decades, and had him draft the temporary documents right there on the spot. The paperwork officially granted Robert and Elena 100% operational control over Atlas Manufacturing. More importantly, it granted them unchecked, unilateral authority to acquire massive corporate debt, sign legally binding vendor contracts, and completely restructure the company's financial liabilities without my oversight or final approval. As they eagerly, almost frantically scrawled their signatures on the dotted lines, they were entirely oblivious to the tiny, ironclad clauses our lawyer had quietly buried deep in the fine print at my secret, prior direction. Those specific clauses effectively removed my name from all future liability documents, meaning any massive financial catastrophe they initiated while I was gone would fall squarely, legally and personally, on their own shoulders. They were so blinded by the sudden transfer of absolute power that they never stopped to wonder why the company's most aggressively cautious founder was suddenly handing them a blank check to hang themselves with. With the ink drying on their corporate death warrants, I told my children a weary, pathetic goodbye and walked out of the building with my shoulders slumped. But I did not drive north to the mountain cabin, not yet. I drove to a dimly lit, faded diner on the absolute outskirts of the industrial district, far away from the polished glass towers of the financial center. Sitting in the back booth, silently sipping black coffee, was Henry. Henry was my oldest friend, my former business partner from the garage days, and the most brilliant, ruthless corporate accountant I had ever had the privilege of knowing. He had retired a decade ago, content to peacefully tend his rose garden and spoil his grandchildren. But when I had called him the night before and quietly explained what my own flesh and blood were plotting to do to me, his warm, grandfatherly eyes had turned into chips of hard, cold flint. We left the diner and spent the next 3 days locked tightly inside the heavily secured study of his home, moving massive mountains of wealth entirely in the shadows, while Robert and Elena were busy popping wildly expensive champagne in my old office, celebrating their newly acquired kingdom and dreaming of their buyout payout. Henry and I were systematically disassembling my entire life savings. I ruthlessly liquidated my private stock portfolios, paying the heavy early withdrawal penalties without a second thought. I cashed out my municipal bonds, and I completely emptied the massive, quiet cash reserves I had diligently, painstakingly built up over 40 long years. We funneled every single penny, tens of millions of dollars, through a complex, dizzying labyrinth of secure, untraceable wire transfers. We moved the capital across borders, funneling it securely into a newly formed, completely anonymous, offshore shell corporation. We named the entity Phoenix Holdings. By the time the sun set on the 3rd day, Arthur, the founder, was officially, legally, and practically broke, on paper. My domestic bank accounts held little more than grocery money. I had absolutely nothing left to my name except my majority shares in Atlas Manufacturing, which my children were already actively plotting to render utterly worthless anyway. But in the shadows, hidden behind a wall of impenetrable legal privacy, Phoenix Holdings was a massive, heavily armed financial war chest waiting patiently for my absolute command. As Henry finalized the last encrypted wire transfer that effectively erased my personal wealth from domestic soil, he looked up from the glowing glow of his computer screens. He warned me that the trap I was currently building required a level of collateral damage that would be completely impossible to reverse once the first heavy domino fell. I looked my oldest friend directly in the eye and told him I was perfectly ready to burn the entire forest down just to smoke out the poisonous snakes hiding in the grass. I thanked him, packed my bags, loaded my old truck, and prepared to actually drive up to the mountain cabin. I had completely removed myself from the blast radius. I had handed Robert and Elena a very long, very thick rope, and I had built the gallows directly underneath them. Now, I just needed to whisper a little bit of encouragement in their ears so they would eagerly tie the knot around their own necks. A single match dropped in a dry forest does not burn it down instantly. It requires a perfectly timed, calculated breeze to fan the tiny spark into an absolute, uncontrollable inferno. I was about to provide that exact breeze to my son's towering, blinding arrogance. The morning before I officially departed for my mountain exile, I packed a small cardboard box with a few personal desk items. Robert was leaning against my office doorframe, sipping an expensive imported espresso, watching me with a thinly veiled smirk. He looked like a conqueror overseeing the final surrender of a defeated enemy king. I let my shoulders droop, playing the part of the weary, defeated old man one last time. I paused, holding a heavy crystal paperweight, and looked up at him with manufactured hesitation. I told him that during my sleepless nights, I had been thinking heavily about his grand vision for the company. I confessed that perhaps my conservative, old-fashioned mindset had indeed been holding Atlas Manufacturing back from its true global potential. I specifically brought up a massive, highly aggressive expansion plan he had pitched 2 years prior, a plan to purchase and entirely retrofit a gargantuan manufacturing compound overseas. At the time, I had completely vetoed it because the upfront capital required was astronomical and the financial risk was entirely ruinous. But now, I looked at my son and softly admitted that he might have been right all along. I told him that if he truly wanted to impress Vance Capital and inflate the final buyout price to astronomical heights, a massive international footprint would be the ultimate crown jewel. I sighed heavily, looking away, and muttered that traditional banks would take 6 months just to underwrite a loan of that magnitude, a delay that modern visionaries like him simply could not afford. I watched the greed instantly ignite behind Robert's eyes. He practically vibrated with excitement by planting the idea as a concession of my own failure. I guaranteed he would pursue it with absolute, reckless abandon. He wanted to prove he was the superior businessman, and he wanted that inflated buyout money desperately. What Robert did not know was that I had already predicted exactly which predatory, unregulated private equity firm he would rush to for the fast capital. A ruthless syndicate of financial sharks I had personally blacklisted 15 years ago for their notoriously draconian collateral demands. I left the office that afternoon and spent the next 48 hours executing the most painful, yet strictly necessary, phase of my entire operation. I secretly arranged completely confidential, face-to-face meetings with the chief executive officers of my 3 largest, oldest legacy clients. These were the colossal aerospace and heavy automotive titans whose massive, recurring contracts constituted a staggering 80% of our total annual revenue. These men and women were not just business associates. They were old friends who had trusted my handshake for decades. I met David, a senior vice president of a major commercial airline manufacturer, in a quiet, dimly lit booth at a private steakhouse downtown. When I slid a highly classified, independent metallurgical report across the table, the color completely drained from his face. I explained, with genuine sorrow in my voice, that my children had forcefully seized operational control of Atlas and were actively sourcing incredibly dangerous, substandard alloys from unverified vendors to artificially pad their quarterly margins. I told David that the structural integrity of the aircraft parts we were shipping them was severely compromised. I looked my oldest client in the eye and told him to invoke the emergency quality control break clause in our master contract the absolute second his engineers found a single microscopic defect. I told him to pull his entire account, cancel all pending orders, and walk away from Atlas Manufacturing without a single backward glance. David sat in stunned silence, staring at the damning paperwork. He asked me what I would possibly do when the dust settled and my legacy was reduced to ashes, completely unaware that my ultimate endgame involved a silent courtroom, a ruthless lawyer, and a very specific anonymous buyer waiting in the shadows. I repeated this exact, grueling process with the other two massive clients. I burned my own ships. I actively, deliberately sabotaged the immediate future of the company I had spent 40 years building, because protecting the safety of the public and the trust of my friends was far more important than protecting my children's unearned inheritance. By the time I finally drove out of the city limits, heading north toward the rugged mountain ranges, the trap was fully primed and waiting for the final trigger. Back in the city, Robert and Elena were moving with blinding speed, completely drunk on their own absolute power, just as I had perfectly anticipated. Robert sprinted directly to the predatory private equity firm to secure a staggering $40 million loan for his overseas expansion project. Because my newly drafted legal documents brilliantly shielded me from corporate debt, and because the company's liquid assets were already being drained by their lavish spending. The vicious lenders demanded extraordinary collateral for such a massive, high-risk, unsecured cash injection. Elena, blinded by the promise of the Vance Capital buyout and believing they would flip the company for a massive profit in less than 60 days, made the most catastrophic, foolish miscalculation of her entire life. She and Robert confidently signed ironclad, inescapable personal guarantees. To secure the $40 million, they legally pledged their sprawling luxury mansions, their fleets of exotic sports cars, their entire private stock portfolios, and every single penny they held in their personal, domestic bank accounts. They willingly strapped a financial bomb to their own chests, entirely convinced that the timer would never reach zero. I arrived at my isolated wooden cabin just as the sun was beginning to dip below the jagged tree line. The air was remarkably crisp, smelling strongly of pine needles and damp earth. I carried my bags inside, walked over to the small, dusty kitchen counter, and took my cell phone out of my pocket. I held the power button down and watched the screen go completely black. I tossed the lifeless piece of plastic into the bottom drawer and closed it firmly. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, I poured myself a generous glass of aged bourbon on a Tuesday evening, walked out onto the wooden back porch, and sat down in an old rocking chair. I listened to the absolute, unbroken silence of the deep woods. There were no ringing telephones. There were no roaring steel presses. There were no scheming children whispering in dark hallways. 300 miles away, the heavy iron jaws of the trap were already snapping shut. The substandard metal was flowing onto the production lines. The millions of dollars in toxic debt had just hit the ledger. The corporate vultures were circling overhead. I took a slow, deep sip of my drink, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of peace wash over me, patiently waiting for the magnificent, destructive collapse of their entire stolen empire. A castle built on a foundation of lies will inevitably crumble, but the terrifying speed of the collapse is always a breathtaking thing to witness. While I was peacefully casting a fishing line into the glassy waters of a remote mountain lake, my children were watching their stolen kingdom violently burn to the ground. I spent my days chopping firewood, reading old paperback novels by the light of a kerosene lamp, and breathing in the sharp, clean scent of the high-altitude pine forest. I slept soundly for the first time in years. I did not need a television or a ringing telephone to know exactly what was happening back in the city. I knew the precise manufacturing cycles of my own company, and I knew exactly when the poison they had injected into the supply chain would finally reach the heart. Back at Atlas Manufacturing, Robert was moving with the frantic, blind energy of a man completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. With the $40 million high-interest loan secured, he immediately wired the vast majority of the funds to the unverified overseas factory. He bypassed every standard corporate safety protocol, ignoring the desperate warnings of our few remaining domestic engineers. He wanted immediate product. He needed to show Marcus Vance, The corporate raider, a massive, sudden spike in global inventory to justify their astronomical buyout demands. The overseas facility happily took the cash and began churning out thousands of components using the cheap, degraded metal alloys Elena had sourced to artificially inflate their profit margins. They stamped out commercial aviation brackets, heavy machinery gears, and high-pressure hydraulic casings. To the untrained eye, the shiny new parts looked identical to the precision engineering Atlas had built its flawless reputation on. But you cannot cheat the fundamental laws of physics. I knew Robert was too arrogant to hire independent quality control inspectors for the new overseas facility, a fatal oversight that Vance Capital's notoriously ruthless forensic accountants would undoubtedly discover. But Vance was about to be the least of his immediate problems. The massive cargo ships arrived at the coastal ports. The heavy wooden crates were unloaded and immediately trucked directly to our 3 largest legacy clients. Robert and Elena were reportedly popping expensive champagne in the executive suites, celebrating the flawless execution of their global expansion, eagerly waiting for the final buyout paperwork from Vance Capital. Then, the aerospace engineers at David's commercial airline company unpacked the first batch of the new titanium alloy compressor blades. In the high-stakes world of aerospace manufacturing, there is absolutely zero margin for error. A microscopic fracture in a single turbine blade can bring a commercial airliner falling out of the sky. David's team took the new parts into their testing laboratories and subjected them to standard, rigorous stress simulations. The results were catastrophic. The cheap, porous alloys did not just bend under the simulated atmospheric pressure, they violently shattered into dangerous, jagged shrapnel. David, true to the solemn promise he made during our secret meeting weeks prior, did not hesitate for a single second. He did not ask for a refund. He did not ask for a replacement batch. He immediately invoked the absolute ironclad breach of contract clause buried deep within our master agreement. His legal team sent a certified, blistering cease and desist letter directly to Robert's desk, formally terminating a massive, recurring contract worth tens of millions of dollars annually. They completely severed a 30-year business relationship in a single afternoon. The dominoes fell with terrifying, deafening speed. Less than 48 hours later, our second largest client, a massive heavy automotive manufacturer, ran their own routine metallurgical scans on a shipment of steering column casings. They found intolerable structural deviations and severe microfractures hidden beneath the polished surface. They immediately rejected the entire shipment and officially pulled their account. By the end of the week, our third major client, a prominent defense contractor, followed suit, citing a catastrophic failure to meet federal safety standards. In the span of 5 short business days, Atlas Manufacturing lost a staggering 80% of its total operating revenue. The financial shockwave tore through the executive suites like a devastating hurricane. Robert and Elena were suddenly staring at a terrifying abyss. The enormous cash reserves they thought they had were completely gone, drained by their lavish personal bonuses and entirely squandered on the toxic overseas expansion. They had a massive domestic payroll approaching. They had exorbitant utility bills for the factory floor. They had outstanding vendor invoices piling up by the hour. And suddenly, they had absolutely zero money coming in to cover any of it. Panic, thick and suffocating, finally set in. Robert desperately tried to call David, leaving frantic, pleading voicemails, but his calls were completely ignored. Elena spent hours screaming at the overseas factory managers, demanding a refund for the defective parts, only to be laughed at and hung up on. They were bleeding cash at a mortal rate, and their grand, arrogant vision of corporate empire building was rapidly turning into a spectacular, very public nightmare. In a last, desperate bid for survival, they scrambled to accelerate the buyout with Marcus Vance. They invited the notorious corporate raider back into the boardroom, practically begging him to finalize the $50 million cash transaction immediately. They hoped to quickly sell the rotting carcass of the company before the smell of death became too obvious to hide. But Marcus Vance was a highly evolved apex predator, and he did not survive in the brutal world of private equity by being a fool. Before signing a single legal document, his team of aggressive forensic accountants demanded a final, updated sweep of the company's daily ledgers. When Vance sat down at the mahogany table and looked at the freshly printed financial reports, his cold, reptilian smile instantly vanished. He saw the catastrophic 80% drop in active revenue. He saw the devastating breach of contract letters from the 3 largest legacy clients. He saw the massive $40 million high-interest loan weighing down the balance sheet like a concrete anchor. He saw a company that was not just struggling, but legally toxic and financially terminal. Vance slowly stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and looked at my children with absolute, unvarnished disgust. He did not bother to negotiate a lower price. He did not offer a single word of corporate sympathy. He simply told them that Atlas Manufacturing was a worthless, radioactive liability. And he permanently pulled his $50 million offer off the table. He walked out of the boardroom without looking back, taking their golden parachute with him. The heavy, soundproof doors clicked shut, leaving Robert and Elena completely alone in the suffocating silence of their ruined kingdom. The dream of their easy, multi-million-dollar payday evaporated into thin air. They were utterly trapped, surrounded by furious creditors, legally bound to a dying company, and totally paralyzed by their own profound incompetence. They frantically tried to locate me, leaving dozens of desperate voicemails on a phone that was sitting completely dead in a kitchen drawer 300 miles away, entirely unaware that their true nightmare was only just beginning to unfold in the form of a heavily armored legal assault I had prepared months in advance. A storm had completely washed away the foundation of their towering arrogance. But I was about to casually walk into the smoking wreckage holding the only umbrella. After exactly 90 days of total isolation in the deep mountain woods, I packed my faded duffel bag, locked the sturdy wooden door of my cabin, and drove back down toward the suffocating concrete of the city. I was tanned from long afternoons on the lake. My hands were calloused from chopping seasoned oak, and my mind was sharper than it had been in a decade. I felt like a man who had finally woken up from a terrible, prolonged fever dream. I knew exactly what awaited me at the corporate headquarters of Atlas Manufacturing, and I was looking forward to the absolute carnage with a cold, terrifying serenity. I parked my dusty 10-year-old pickup truck in the executive parking lot. It was jarringly empty. Robert's $500,000 exotic sports car was nowhere to be seen, likely repossessed or hidden in a desperate attempt to shield it from aggressive repo men. The manicured lawns were overgrown, and the grand fountain near the main entrance had completely run dry. When I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby, the atmosphere was entirely different from the bustling, arrogant hive of corporate consultants I had left behind 3 months prior. The massive building felt like a haunted tomb. The receptionist desk was entirely abandoned. The phones were ringing off the hook, a chaotic chorus of angry creditors and panicked suppliers, but there was no one left to answer them. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, soaking in the profound, heavy silence of a dying empire. I took the elevator up to the executive suites and walked directly into my old, sprawling corner office. Robert and Elena were practically barricaded inside. The sleek, ridiculously expensive designer furniture they had bought to replace my modest desk was covered in towering mountains of past-due invoices, blistering legal threats, and terrifying bank notices. My children looked absolutely hideous. Robert had deep, bruised bags under his bloodshot eyes, his custom-tailored suit deeply wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. He looked like a man who had not slept for a single hour in 3 entire weeks. Elena was sitting on the expensive leather sofa, her head buried in her hands, her perfectly manicured nails completely chewed down to the bleeding quick. When the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, they both jumped as if a gunshot had gone off in the room. They stared at me, their eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate mixture of shock and sheer terror. I simply smiled, a warm, relaxed, entirely terrifying smile, and asked them how the modern, aggressive corporate expansion was treating them. The sheer audacity of my calm demeanor snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity Robert was still clinging to. He leaped up from the desk, his face contorting into an ugly, vicious mask of pure rage. He immediately went on the offensive, pointing a trembling finger right at my chest. He screamed that this entire catastrophic collapse was entirely my fault. He shrieked that my archaic, outdated relationships with the legacy clients had been a ticking time bomb. He blamed my stubborn blue-collar leadership for crippling the company's infrastructure, claiming that when they tried to pivot to a modern global model, the weak foundation I had built simply shattered under the pressure. Elena chimed in, her voice shrill and hysterical, accusing me of intentionally hiding the fragile nature of the aerospace contracts from them just to watch them fail. They were frantically trying to gaslight me, desperately attempting to rewrite history and pin their $40 million toxic failure squarely onto my weary shoulders. They needed a scapegoat to offer the furious private equity sharks, and they thought the foolish, senile old man who had run away to the woods was the perfect, defenseless target. I let them scream until their voices grew hoarse and the veins in their necks bulged. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice to defend my legacy. I simply walked over to the heavy mahogany conference table, opened my scuffed leather briefcase, and pulled out a single, thin manila folder. I tossed it onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed in the dead silent room. I told them, in a voice barely above a whisper, to open the file. I watched as Robert snatched the folder and flipped it open, his bloodshot eyes frantically scanning the neatly typed legal pages. Elena practically climbed over the table to read over his shoulder. Inside the folder were the pristine, notarized copies of the temporary executive power documents they had so eagerly signed before I left for my cabin. But I had highlighted a very specific, incredibly dense paragraph buried deep on the 7th page. It was the absolute, ironclad liability waiver my fiercely loyal corporate attorney had drafted under my explicit direction. I watched the exact moment the devastating reality crashed down upon them. I watched the blood entirely drain from Robert's face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. I spoke slowly, making sure every single syllable pierced their fragile, greedy hearts. I calmly explained that by signing that specific document, they had not just claimed temporary operational control. They had legally, completely, and permanently severed my name from any and all corporate debt, operational liability, and vendor contracts initiated during my 3-month absence. I told them the catastrophic $40 million high-interest loan they took from the predatory private equity firm was entirely their own doing. I reminded them that I had zero legal connection to the unverified, dangerous overseas factory that pumped out the defective titanium components, utterly destroying our domestic reputation. You did not just take the wheel, Robert, I said softly, looking him dead in his terrified eyes. You legally strapped yourselves to the absolute front of the train, right before you drove it directly off a massive cliff. Their smarmy, high-priced lawyer husband, Richard, had been so incredibly eager to have me legally declared mentally unfit and seize my shares that he had completely failed to read the fine print of the operational handover. He was an arrogant fool who assumed an old factory worker could never outsmart a modern corporate litigator. Just as the suffocating weight of my words settled over the room, Elena's cell phone rang. It was a harsh, jarring sound. She answered it with trembling hands, put it on speakerphone, and placed it on the desk. It was a senior collections executive from the unregulated private equity firm. His voice was completely devoid of any human empathy. He coldly informed them that because Atlas Manufacturing had suffered an 80% drop in active revenue and completely breached multiple financial covenants, the $40 million expansion loan was officially an immediate, catastrophic default. Then, the final, crushing blow was delivered. The executive reminded them of the personal guarantees they had so arrogantly signed to secure the fast cash. He formally announced the margin call. He stated that effective immediately, their sprawling luxury mansions were being placed under heavy legal liens. Their fleets of expensive cars were currently being tracked for immediate repossession. Their private stock portfolios, their offshore retirement accounts, and every single penny they held in their domestic bank accounts were completely, legally frozen by a federal judge pending total liquidation. Elena let out a piercing, agonizing wail, completely collapsing onto the floor in a heap of wrinkled designer clothing. She sobbed uncontrollably, realizing that her massive European ski vacations and her country club memberships were instantly gone. Robert simply stared blankly at the wall, completely catatonic, his brain entirely unable to process the absolute, devastating destruction of his life. The private equity shark on the phone offered them one single, miserable lifeline to avoid immediate federal indictment for the gross financial negligence that destroyed the aerospace contracts. He told them they had exactly 48 hours to voluntarily file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They had to completely surrender Atlas Manufacturing to the federal bankruptcy courts, allowing a court-appointed trustee to liquidate the entire company, sell off the massive warehouses, auction off the heavy machinery, and distribute the pennies to the furious creditors. They had absolutely no choice. They were personally millions of dollars in the red, entirely trapped by their own boundless, arrogant greed. I slowly packed my manila folder back into my leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. I looked down at my weeping daughter and my paralyzed son. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely no remorse. They had willingly dug a massive, dark grave, fully intending to throw me inside and bury me alive. I had simply stepped aside and watched them eagerly jump in themselves. I walked out of the executive suites, leaving them to drown in the shallow, pathetic puddle of their own tears. They truly believed that the upcoming bankruptcy auction was the absolute miserable end of the road, a final, humiliating defeat where they would lose everything but somehow crawl away with their freedom. But as I walked to my truck, dialing my oldest friend Henry to initiate the final phase of our shadow operation, they remained entirely oblivious to the apex predator waiting patiently in the dark, ready to buy their ashes for pennies on the dollar. A public execution does not always require a sharp blade. Sometimes, it merely requires a heavy wooden gavel and a cold room full of strangers whispering about your spectacular ruin. The day my life's work was placed on the federal auction block, the air inside the municipal courthouse felt heavier than wet concrete. I slipped into the very last row of the echoing gallery completely unnoticed, pulling the brim of a faded baseball cap down low over my eyes. I sat quietly in the shadows, watching the final, crushing piece of my shadow war sitting patiently inside a sleek leather briefcase just 3 rows ahead of me. The grand, archaic architecture of the courthouse, with its towering marble pillars and vaulted ceilings, stood in stark contrast to the miserable, broken people filing into the wooden benches. Near the very front row sat Robert and Elena. Looking at them, a stranger would never guess they were once the arrogant, wealthy heirs to a manufacturing empire. They looked completely destroyed. Their bespoke designer clothing was gone, replaced by poorly fitting, wrinkled suits that hung awkwardly off their thinning, exhausted frames. The sheer, suffocating stress of the past 3 months had aged them a full decade. Sitting rigidly beside Elena was her husband, Richard, the formerly arrogant corporate lawyer who had so eagerly drafted the paperwork to have me locked away in an asylum. He was constantly checking a cheap plastic watch, a nervous tic that betrayed his utter panic. His high-priced corporate law firm had undoubtedly fired him the absolute second his name became tied to the massive, highly public fraud scandal involving the overseas metal sourcing. They were no longer corporate royalty. They were desperate, cornered animals entirely out of options, praying for a financial miracle that I had personally ensured would never arrive. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the federal bankruptcy trustee took the wooden podium. He was a dry, utterly monotone man who read the grand history of Atlas Manufacturing like a tragic, boring obituary. He coldly listed the staggering mountains of toxic debt, the devastating breach of contract lawsuits from our legacy clients, and the catastrophic failure of the overseas aerospace expansion. Every single word he spoke was a brutal physical blow to Robert and Elena. They physically shrank into their hard wooden benches, burying their faces in their hands. The trustee announced that all remaining company assets would be sold to the highest bidder to satisfy the furious private equity firm and the sprawling army of outstanding creditors. The massive industrial warehouses, the state-of-the-art heavy machinery, the 4 decades of proprietary engineering patents, and the shattered, disgraced brand name itself were all officially on the chopping block. The bidding opened, and it was a completely miserable, humiliating affair. The room was exclusively filled with corporate scavengers, aggressive scrap metal liquidators, and bottom-feeding commercial real estate developers. Absolutely no one wanted to actually run Atlas Manufacturing. The aerospace disaster had turned the brand name into pure poison. These men only wanted to rip the valuable copper wiring out of the factory walls, sell the heavy steel presses for their raw scrap weight, and pave over the warehouses to build cheap strip malls. The initial bids were insultingly low. They were barely high enough to cover the exorbitant legal fees of the bankruptcy court itself. I watched Robert grip the edge of the wooden bench in front of him until his knuckles turned completely white, his shoulders violently shaking. Elena was silently sobbing, frantically wiping her ruined makeup with a shredded paper tissue. They both knew the terrifying mathematical reality of their situation. If the final auction sale price did not completely cover the $40 million high-interest loan they had so arrogantly secured with personal guarantees, the private equity sharks would legally seize every single asset they had left. The banks would foreclose on their luxury homes, empty their remaining domestic accounts, and aggressively push the federal government to file criminal fraud charges against them for the dangerous metal substitution. They were staring directly down the barrel of inescapable, absolute destitution and a very real threat of federal prison time. The trustee sighed heavily, adjusting his reading glasses. He was clearly preparing to accept a pathetic, rock-bottom bid from a notorious local scrap liquidator, a bid that would leave my children owing millions of dollars they simply did not have. He slowly raised the heavy wooden gavel into the air. He called out going once. He called out going twice, before the heavy wood could strike the sounding block and seal their miserable fate. A sharp, deeply authoritative voice cut through the stale courthouse air, signaling the sudden arrival of a phantom entity that was about to swallow the entire carcass of Atlas Manufacturing whole. A tall man wearing a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit stood up from the third row. He was a fiercely intelligent, high-powered corporate attorney I had personally retained through my old friend Henry many months ago. He completely ignored the scavengers in the room and calmly addressed the federal trustee. He stated that he represented a highly private, anonymous investment group known entirely as Phoenix Holdings. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and placed a single, massive, comprehensive bid on the table. He offered to buy the entire corporate estate in one sweeping, unconditional transaction. He wanted the vast warehouses, the specialized machinery, the decades of patents, the remaining raw materials, and the legal rights to the Atlas brand. The courtroom held its collective breath as the attorney stated the exact dollar amount of the bid. It was a brilliant, entirely ruthless masterstroke of financial calculation. He bid exactly enough money to completely satisfy the secured $40 million toxic loan owed to the private equity firm, entirely clear the outstanding local vendor invoices, and pay the mandatory court liquidation fees. He did not offer a single, solitary penny more than that exact sum. He was legally purchasing the clean, unburdened assets of the massive company I had spent 40 years bleeding for, buying it all back for absolute pennies on the dollar compared to its true historical valuation. And because he was buying it out of federal bankruptcy, the new entity, Phoenix Holdings, would absorb absolutely none of the toxic legal liability my children had created. The room fell completely, dead silent. The scrap metal scavengers furiously shook their heads, immediately sitting back down in defeat. They simply could not compete with a massive, verified cash offer of that sheer magnitude. The federal trustee carefully reviewed the certified proof of funds provided by the attorney. A rare, faint smile crossed his face, entirely satisfied to wrap up the incredibly messy, highly publicized affair without further complications. He raised the heavy wooden gavel one final time and brought it down with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot. He declared the estate officially sold to Phoenix Holdings. Robert let out a massive, shuddering gasp of air, completely collapsing against the back of the wooden bench as if his strings had been suddenly cut. Elena threw her arms around Richard's neck, weeping loudly into his cheap suit jacket. They were completely flooded with an overwhelming, intoxicating wave of pure relief. The bid from Phoenix Holdings had entirely wiped out their terrifying, immediate debt to the loan sharks. The immediate threat of federal prison and violent collections agents was officially erased from their lives. But as the adrenaline slowly began to fade from their systems, the horrific, cold reality of their new existence rapidly set in. The massive sale had cleared their toxic debt, but it left them with absolutely zero profit. The grand, $50 million inheritance they had so viciously plotted to steal from me was entirely, permanently gone. Their massive luxury homes were heavily leveraged and would soon be sold by the domestic banks to cover their outstanding personal credit lines. Their fleets of exotic sports cars had already been repossessed in the dead of night. They were walking out of that courthouse with absolutely nothing to their names except the cheap, wrinkled clothes currently on their backs. They were right back to the exact same starting line I stood on 40 years ago, but they entirely lacked the grit, the profound work ethic, and the soul required to ever build an empire from the dirt. The gallery slowly began to empty, the scavengers grumbling as they shuffled out into the hallway. I remained completely hidden in the dark shadows of the back row, watching the final act of their humiliation unfold. Robert and Elena stood up on shaky, trembling legs. They nervously approached the charcoal-suited attorney representing Phoenix Holdings, who was methodically snapping the brass locks of his briefcase shut. In the echoing silence of the massive room, I could hear their desperate, pleading voices perfectly. They were actually begging him. Robert frantically tried to sell his own supposed expertise. He practically groveled, telling the cold attorney that he understood the complex internal machinery and the deep supply chains of Atlas Manufacturing better than anyone alive. He aggressively promised that he and Elena could seamlessly help the anonymous buyers transition the newly acquired assets, manage the remaining angry floor workers, and rapidly rebuild the shattered brand name. They were desperately begging for a job, pleading for an entry-level salary, aggressively hunting for a tiny crumb of mercy from the phantom giant that had just swallowed their stolen kingdom. The sharp attorney paused, resting his hand on his briefcase. He looked at my entirely broken children with absolute, freezing disdain. He did not offer them a handshake. He did not offer them a single ounce of professional sympathy. He coldly informed them that the primary anonymous shareholder of Phoenix Holdings was currently waiting for them inside the old executive boardroom at the main factory headquarters. He casually mentioned that the new owner explicitly wished to have one brief, final, face-to-face meeting with the disgraced former management to discuss the absolute, immediate surrender of the commercial premises. Robert and Elena eagerly nodded their heads, a pathetic, sickening spark of foolish hope suddenly igniting in their exhausted, red-rimmed eyes. They actually believed they had a fighting chance to charm their way back into the massive building, completely convinced their silver tongues could win over this mysterious corporate savior. They practically ran out of the massive oak doors of the courthouse, rushing frantically onto the busy sidewalk to hail a cheap city cab, entirely unaware that they were eagerly, breathlessly sprinting toward their own final, devastating reckoning. I sat quietly in the empty gallery for 5 full minutes, listening to the absolute silence. Then, I slowly stood up, adjusted my faded baseball cap, and walked out into the bright, warm afternoon sun. It was finally time for me to go back to work. There is a profound, almost electric silence that settles over a room just before a heavy blade finally drops. I was sitting comfortably in the exact center of that magnificent silence, waiting patiently for my executioners to eagerly place their own necks upon the wooden block. I had arrived at the Atlas Manufacturing headquarters a full hour before them. The massive building was practically a ghost town, echoing with the failures of the past 3 months. I took the private executive elevator up to the top floor and walked directly into the grand mahogany boardroom. I took my rightful seat at the absolute head of the long table. My corporate attorney, the fiercely intelligent man who had just publicly purchased my entire legacy for pennies on the dollar, stood silently by the frosted glass window, neatly organizing the final transfer documents. I poured myself a cold glass of ice water and waited for the final act of this tragedy to unfold. I wondered briefly if they would actually have the foolish courage to show their faces, but I knew desperate greed was a blinding motivator. Down in the lobby, the elevator chimed. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed down the carpeted hallway. The grand wooden doors of the boardroom swung open. Robert stepped in first. He was hastily trying to smooth out his wrinkled suit jacket, plastering a desperate, incredibly fake smile of corporate submission across his exhausted face. Elena followed closely behind, clutching her cheap purse to her chest like a life preserver. Richard trailed them, his eyes darting nervously around the room, entirely stripped of his former legal arrogance. They were fully prepared to grovel on their knees to a mysterious, phantom billionaire. They were entirely unprepared to see their aging, supposedly broken father sitting comfortably on the throne they had so viciously stolen from him. The fake smile immediately melted off Robert's face. He froze entirely in his tracks, his jaw dropping open in sheer disbelief. Elena let out a sharp, genuine gasp of pure shock, instinctively taking a massive step backward and bumping roughly into her husband. "Dad," Robert choked out. His voice was a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. "What are you doing here? Where's the new owner of the estate?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water and set the glass down. The sharp clink echoed loudly in the massive, silent room. "I am the absolute sole owner. Robert," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "Phoenix Holdings is a private entity completely funded by my personal, offshore wealth, the massive wealth you thought you were going to effortlessly seize with a fraudulent medical proxy. Welcome back to my company." I watched the staggering, devastating weight of my words violently crash into their fragile minds. I watched their eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated horror as the terrifying pieces of the puzzle rapidly snapped together. "No," Elena stammered, shaking her head frantically, her voice trembling with rising panic. "That is completely impossible. You were trapped in the mountains. You legally gave us the company. You lost everything when the aerospace clients left." "I did not lose everything, Elena," I replied softly, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the polished mahogany. "I orchestrated every single detail." Before I left for the cabin, my oldest friend and I secretly transferred every single penny of my personal domestic wealth into a secure, anonymous offshore shell corporation. I deliberately stepped aside and handed you the absolute legal rope to hang yourselves with. And then, I personally met with David and my other legacy clients. I handed them the classified metallurgical reports detailing your dangerous, cheap overseas metal. I personally told them to pull their massive contracts. Richard, the slick corporate lawyer who had so eagerly drafted the petition to lock me in a state-run asylum, suddenly looked as if he was going to violently vomit right there on the expensive carpet. He finally realized that the senile, blue-collar mechanic had completely outmaneuvered him on a grand, impenetrable legal scale. Robert's face rapidly flushed with a bright, entirely impotent rage. He lunged forward, forcefully slamming his fists onto the table. "You destroyed your own company!" Robert screamed, spittle flying from his trembling lips. "You intentionally ruined your entire legacy just to spite us. You are an absolute monster." "I did not destroy my legacy," I corrected him, my voice turning to cold, unforgiving steel. "I surgically removed a deadly cancer from it. I purged a pair of greedy, ruthless parasites who were perfectly willing to legally erase my mind and lock me in a mental ward just to steal a $50 million buyout. You viciously planned to strip me of my dignity, my autonomy, and my life's work. I simply allowed your own boundless arrogance to do the exact same thing to you." I looked at the three of them, entirely broken, completely destitute, and utterly defeated. I felt a profound sense of absolute closure. The grieving process for the children I thought I raised was officially over. The $40 million toxic debt you created has been wiped clean by my strategic purchase, I stated plainly. You will not go to federal prison for your catastrophic, dangerous negligence. Consider that my final, absolute gift to you as a father. But you are leaving this building with absolutely nothing. Your mansions are gone. Your sports cars are gone. Your grand inheritance is entirely ashes. You are right back to the dirty starting line where I stood 40 years ago. I gestured to my attorney. He stepped forward and calmly handed Robert a single, legally binding piece of paper. You have exactly 5 minutes to permanently vacate my premises, I ordered, standing up from my chair and buttoning my suit jacket. If you are not off my private property by then, my security team will forcefully drag you out for criminal trespassing. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. They did not fight back. They had absolutely no financial leverage, no legal standing, and no dignity left to fight with. Elena buried her face in her hands, weeping bitterly as Richard roughly grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the exit. Robert stood there for one final, silent second, looking at me with dead, hollow eyes, finally realizing the terrifying magnitude of his own fatal mistake. He slowly turned around and walked out. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them forever. I stood completely alone in the grand boardroom. The silence was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was magnificently peaceful. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed a number I knew completely by heart. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Arthur?" David asked, sounding incredibly cautious on the other end of the line. "The toxic elements have been permanently removed from the supply chain." "David," I said, a genuine, warm smile finally breaking across my tired face. "Atlas Manufacturing is under completely new, entirely sole ownership. We are returning to the old, uncompromising standard of excellence. I would like to personally invite you to a private dinner tonight to discuss fully reinstating your commercial aerospace contracts." David let out a loud, booming laugh of pure relief. He agreed instantly. My next phone call was to Thomas, my fiercely loyal floor manager of 20 years. I woke him up from a late morning nap. I told him to put his heavy steel-toed work boots back on and get down to the factory floor immediately. I offered him his old job back with a massive 20% salary increase and full operational oversight of the domestic assembly lines. I could hear his wife cheering joyfully in the background. Over the next few weeks, the massive iron giant that was Atlas Manufacturing slowly roared back to magnificent life. The dangerous substandard overseas metal was entirely scrapped and melted down. I brought back every single loyal employee my children had ruthlessly fired to save a few pennies. The legacy clients returned, their trust fully restored by my absolute, unyielding commitment to their public safety and our deeply shared history. I am 68 years old, and my hands are covered in grease and calluses once again. I walk the noisy, bustling factory floor every single morning, shaking hands with the men and women who truly built this towering empire with me. I lost my biological children to the poisonous allure of unearned wealth, but I successfully saved the family that actually mattered. I protected the honest, hard-working people who relied on me to feed their own families, and I secured a legacy built on rigid integrity, not just meaningless numbers on a spreadsheet. I finally found my peace, not in a quiet mountain cabin, but right here amidst the beautiful, deafening roar of the heavy steel presses. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story. If you found my journey to reclaim my life's work satisfying, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a hard-fought victory. Leave a comment down below with the word karma so I know you made it all the way to the end. And please, do not forget to hit the hype button so this video can reach more viewers who love a story about absolute justice.